Welcome to the Breath of God. This is a channel dedicated to studying the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Over the last 45 days, we've reached over 42,000 people with the gospel of Jesus and Bible teaching. Therefore, I've opened up a secure online link at the top of my YouTube page, and I'm looking for 3 partners to give $3,000 each with a one-time donation to fund the ongoing operations here as I dedicate myself to teaching God's Word. Thank you. And today we'll get to the book of Job, and I've entitled this Double for Your Trouble. Now, the book of Job is incredibly rich. There is so much truth and so much grace in this single book. It is the first of the 5 poetical books. So the first one is Job, then Psalms, then Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes, and then Song of Solomon. And Job is a story of a man's life in poetic form. And it has 3 main parts. The first 2 chapters are the prologue, that's the introduction. The middle part is the dialogue, and that's chapters 3 through 42, verse 6. And this is the middle part. And then the epilogue, or the conclusion, which is 42:7 through 17. Now, in the book of Job, at the very beginning, you're going to find 3 characters. You're going to find Job, God, and Satan. And you find Job in that first chapter. He's the greatest man of the East. And God says of him, there is no one like Job who shuns evil and fears God. And Satan challenges this claim and says, you've put a hedge of protection around Job. Hey, I bet if you take all that stuff, he will curse you to your face. And God says, okay, I give you permission to sift him. So there's this thing that's going on in the heavenly realms, which Job is completely unaware of. So then, in a single day, he essentially loses everything, one tragic event after another. And he doesn't curse God. And so Satan asks to sift him again and make him ill. Basically, take everything from him except for his life and his wife. And still, Job does not curse God or accuse God of wrongdoing. He said, the Lord gives and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And you find in this first 2 chapters, when God speaks about Job, he talks about there's no one like Job who fears God and shuns evil. God talks about the righteousness of Job. Well, if you see a little bit of that in the first chapter. Job, for example, would offer sacrifices after his kids would gather together and they would have celebrations together. And Job would offer a sacrifice to God just in case they set a curse against God in their mind. And this was Job's regular practice. So even when there was no evidence of an offense against God, Job even offered preemptively a sacrifice to God just in case. He valued his relationship with God and his right standing with the Lord. And then you find Job's righteousness further explained. If you go to Job chapter 31, verses 1 through 32, you see how Job's righteousness is described. And this is actually amazing. I've never met a man as righteous as Job. Like the first thing he says, he talks about his eyes. He made a covenant with his eyes not to look lustfully at a young girl. Job did not commit the sin of lust. Job was kind and just in all the dealings with his employees, that no one could bring an offense or a charge against Job, his men servants and his maidservants. And then you see Job did not deny the poor. So when there were vulnerable people around Job, the poor and the fatherless, Job took care of the needs of the poor. And then his wealth. He didn't put his trust in his wealth, and he talks about that. And then his enemies. He never rejoiced when his enemies suffered loss or was harmed. Ever. Strangers. He helped strangers, people that were just passing through. He demonstrated hospitality. He opened up his home to every stranger that passed through where he was living. So Job was an unbelievably righteous and upright man. So you find that, like I said again, if you go to Job chapter 31, verses 1 through 32, you see the righteousness of Job. So it's really important to understand what kind of individual Job was even prior to his testing. And he is described as the greatest man of the East. So then we move into chapter 3 through 42:6. And this is the dialogue. So there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth. So you have Job's opening complaint to God about everything that had occurred. And understand that at this point in Job's experience, he had no idea what was happening in the heavenly realm. Just all of a sudden, a series of tragic events come upon the man, and he loses everything except for Mrs. Job and his life, with no explanation at all. And then Job's 3 friends show up, and then later a younger gentleman by the name of Elihu. So in this middle section, you have 3 triads, and it's these 3 friends of Job who initially came to comfort Job, and they sat with Job for 7 days. They were actually horrified by his appearance. He looked so bad, and his situation was so bad, they did not even know what to say. So they were speechless for 7 days. And then begins a series of assaults, verbal assaults. Job issues this initial complaint, and then there's a series of 3 rounds of accusation. Job's 3 friends accuse him and attempt to make a case for why all the horrible things had happened to Job. And they all fail to make that case. And then Elihu, who's a younger gentleman, appears and he speaks to Job. And then finally, the third thing is God then shows up, and he makes the closing case with Job. And this is in chapters 38, 1 through 42:16. Now, this is the longest recorded speech of God you have in the entire Bible. It's, if you subtract Job's words, it's like 126 verses long. So God, the Spirit is speaking. Like I said, this is the longest speech given by God. And it's a very fascinating speech. And in fact, if you study this speech by God, it will change your fundamental understanding of reality, creation. It is profound. And so after this speech from God, Job says, "Woe is me. I'm nothing but dust and ashes. I despise myself." He said, "I had heard of you, but now I have seen you with my own eyes." All Job's complaints were gone. They melted away. And the bigger reality of God and who he was and what he was doing in this moment changed Job. It purified Job. It's really amazing when you get over here to the epilogue. Job has children again, and he names his 3 daughters. In their study, you can look up their names. You just type it in the Google search and look up their Hebrew name. But basically his first daughter's name means purity. His second daughter's name is like cinnamon. It means sweetness. And his third daughter's name means beauty. So the response of Job is God has created a purity, a sweetness, a beauty in my life that I didn't have before. And all claims of self-righteousness were gone. I mean, completely gone. Job was wrecked, and at the same time, he was transformed. And then you see God come out and rebuke 3 of Job's friends and says, "What you have said of me is not right. And everything that you said about my servant Job is going to happen to you, basically, if he doesn't pray for you." So Job prays for his friends and forgives them. And then what you find is God then ends up blessing Job double for all his trouble. And his friends, his brothers and family come forward and they give gifts to Job, recognizing God's hand or favor upon Job's life. And then Job ends up living a full life, seeing his descendants down to the 4th generation. Again, this is an amazing book. You see the blessing that came through the suffering. And again, this was not suffering that Job inflicted upon himself. This is suffering that came upon a man for a redemptive purpose of sanctifying him. I find that like Romans 8:28 and Hebrews 12:11 are good New Testament scriptures that help unlock the meaning of the book of Job. So, for we know, for like Romans 8:28, "For in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose." Or Hebrews 12:11, that no discipline is pleasant at the time, but it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And you see that the Lord's discipline. This is corrective and instructive, not punitive discipline, but corrective and instructive. And it changes Job. Job's life also shows us the favor of God. Job was favored prior to his testing, and he was favored in the testing because God put limits on this. He was in control of the testing that he was undergoing. And then we see Job blessed after the testing. So we see favor before, we see favor in, and we see favor after. So the favor of God is also a theme. So when things are going well, this was the favor of God. When he was going through the testing and trial of his soul, it was the favor of God. And then in the third stage, when he came out of the other side, was also the favor of God. Job also gives us a wonderful picture of man's need for a mediator, man's need for an intercessor. Job's constant complaint was, who can I go to? Who can mediate for me? And this points to Jesus, who is the mediator of a new covenant. Jesus is the only man that can mediate between God and man, because Jesus is the God-man, and he is the great intercessor for us before the Father. And he is the one who intercedes for us today when Satan comes to make accusations against us. Satan is the accuser of the brethren. You even see this in the Gospels. Satan said to Jesus that he wanted to sift Peter, and the Lord told Peter, Satan has asked to sift you. So you see this ongoing accusation that's made against the brethren, but we have an intercessor. We have Jesus, who intercedes for us day and night as our great high priest, our mediator before the Father. And this is Job's experience, brings out man's need for a mediator before God. And Job's experience also shows us this whole spiritual reality of things that are going on outside of our normal lives, and gives some explanation of why things happen, why tragedy comes, why death comes, all these things. And to trust in God when things don't make sense, and not to doubt the favor and the blessing of God upon your life. Friend, I hope this lesson in the book of Job has been a blessing to you. I pray you may walk through whatever process that you're in right now. You may not doubt the favor of God, the blessing of God, the goodness of God towards you. And if you're going through this part of it where it's difficult and you're experiencing loss and it doesn't make a lot of sense, I pray you may walk through it. The Lord may strengthen you through this process. He may bring a sweetness, a purity, a beauty out of your life in the midst of the testing. And you, my friend, may see the goodness of the Lord and declare the works of the Lord in the land of the living. You may sow in tears, but reap with shouts, with dancing in great joy. Thank you for listening today at the Breath of God. And remember, his breath is our calling. Bye.